My state of Victoria has decided to pursue a treaty with its Indigenous people. Now, this has all been in the works for a while, but during the week, the Victorian opposition, the Coalition, announced they would give bipartisan support to setting up the Treaty Authority, which will be charged with making this thing happen. Now, it would seem there is almost universal support within the Victorian Parliament for this treaty, and this support seems to have come without any conditions. We have no idea what a treaty would do or what it would lead to, and one of the few parliamentarians who has spoken out against this is Liberal MP Tim Smith. Here is what he had to say during the week.
I do not believe that a government, particularly a state government, can enter into treaties with their own citizens. This land belongs to all Australians, black and white alike, and divisive tokenism, like this treaty, further perpetuates the further undermining of Australia's unity.
Now, Mr Smith, he's got this quaint idea that we should all be equal under the law, that no race should be singled out over any other by any parliament or governing body in this country. And he's right. One of Australia's great strengths is the depth and breadth of its racial and cultural mix. We are one of the most diverse countries in the world, and we're all better for it. Why shouldn't we enjoy the best parts of other people's cultures? It's part of the great fabric of this wide brown land. This is a country where all people should be equal. Absolutely everyone. Black or white, male or female, gay or straight. Discrimination must not exist, and anywhere we find it, it must be expunged. Victorian Nationals leader Peter Walsh, the opposition Aboriginal Affairs spokesman, said during the week, quote, "The Liberals and Nationals are committed to advancing the treaty process in Victoria in a way that supports self-determination and reconciliation while strengthening community and connection to country." Now, there's nothing wrong with what he said there. I agree with him. We should support self-determination and reconciliation. We should do everything in our power to make sure that Australia's Indigenous people can lead better lives. We know their life expectancies are shorter. We know the heightened rates of violence and health issues in Aboriginal communities. These are practical things we should be changing to improve people's lives. But I come back to my previous question. How will a treaty achieve any of that? What will a treaty actually do? How will it actually improve anyone's life? Are we looking at the taxpayer having to pay reparations, for instance, to Aboriginal people who have not been personally dispossessed of any land? Are we talking about a document that would essentially create two classes of people, the Indigenous and the non-Indigenous? Now, if it goes down that road, it sets a dangerous precedent of separating Australians by race, which is something right-thinking people have fought against worldwide for decades. But if it doesn't go down that road, then it will simply be a series of motherhood statements that, as so often seems to be the case when we discuss Aboriginal affairs, does absolutely nothing to improve anyone's life. This treaty authority in Victoria will essentially exist outside of the government. It'll be given legal powers to negotiate deals and settle disputes between the government and Indigenous people. What exactly these deals and disputes are, we have no idea, and it will not report to any minister. So its powers are extensive and essentially unregulated. Marcus Stewart, who is the co-chair of the First Peoples Assembly, which has been advocating for this treaty in Victoria, said this week that in entering these discussions, the Victorian government was, quote, relinquishing some of its control and power, and together we are creating new institutions that will be guided by Aboriginal law and cultural authority. Now, I'm all for governments giving up some of their control, but what Mr Stewart is talking about is replacing it with something else. He's talking about fundamentally changing the way government works, and these discussions have essentially been given the green light by the entire Victorian Parliament. So I don't think it's unfair to say, wait a minute, let's back up here. And so many of the people who advocate for things like a treaty spend more time dividing this nation than they do trying to improve it. Look at Adam Bandt and his moronic flag stunt during the week, for instance. He had one of his staff remove the Australian flag from his press conference so he could make some stupid point about race. Here it is.
You chose not to stand in front of the Australian flag. Why is that?
Well, I think we've got a lot of work to do in this country to tell the truth. It's time to understand that the history of this country and the symbols that represent the history of this country are very hurtful to the First Nations people of this country.
It was a deliberate and pointed action designed purely to sow division. The whole idea of reconciliation is, would you believe it, to reconcile our differences, settle our disputes, make Indigenous and all other Australians one. It's a noble aim to which we should all strive, and it is achieved by bringing everybody together, not by denigrating the flag that represents this country. But division gives people like Adam Bandt something to complain about and a reason to beat his chest. If he actually fixed the things he complains about, he'd be redundant. There's a reason many of the people who carry on ad nauseum about Australia Day and the flag never say boo about the fact Aboriginal women are more than 30 times more likely to be hospitalised with domestic violence-related injuries than anyone else in this country. That statistic is a disgrace. But it's not just a statistic. It is real harm that is happening to real people every day in this country, and it's rarely talked about. And a treaty won't stop the violence, only practical solutions will. But people like Mr Bandt are not interested in difficult issues and real solutions. It's all about optics. And then you have that other silly green, Lydia Thorpe, who last week said the Australian Parliament had no permission to be here, that her role as an Indigenous senator, Indigenous woman, was to infiltrate the Senate, and that the Australian flag represented colonisation. That's not reconciliation, that's division. Carol Martin was a Labor MP in Perth. She was the first Indigenous woman elected to any Australian Parliament. In light of Bandt's antics, she said, quote, "We are having a discussion now about a voice and the statement from the heart, and if you want to bring people on board, why would you kick them in the ghoulies?" She's exactly right. This country should embrace Indigenous culture. I've always admired the way that Maori culture is essentially just part of New Zealand culture. We have a lot to be proud of in this country's Indigenous history. But something like a treaty shouldn't be allowed to just sail on through, especially when you have people like Mr Bandt and Ms Thorpe leading these discussions. As a country, we must always remember the aim is reconciliation, not separation.